The power did not fail in Derry the way it was supposed to fail. There was no single moment that people could later point to and say, "That was it. That was when the night turned wrong." Because the darkness did not arrive like an intruder kicking in a door, but instead seeped in slowly, patiently, the way cold creeps through the walls of an old house in winter, unnoticed at first, and then suddenly everywhere. On Witcham Street, where the houses leaned toward one another like tired old men sharing secrets, Mrs. Hargreaves stood on her porch shaking out a rug that had once been blue and was now a permanent, sorrowful gray, when the bulb above her head flickered twice, gave off a final sickly yellow glow, and died, leaving her standing there in the half-light with the uneasy feeling that something had just stopped watching over her. She stared up at the dead bulb for a long moment, lips pressed thin, as if expecting it to apologize. "Well, that's just perfect," she muttered finally, and dragged the rug back inside, unaware that 3 blocks away the traffic signal at Main and Canal had frozen on red, trapping a small line of cars whose drivers leaned on their horns in growing irritation until the signal went black entirely, at which point the honking stopped, replaced by an uncomfortable silence and the shared, unspoken agreement that getting home quickly now seemed like a very good idea. Along the cracked walking path near the Barrens, where no children played anymore, despite the town insisting that there was nothing wrong with letting them do so, the old sodium lamps dimmed one by one, each taking a moment to sputter and resist before surrendering, until the path lay in darkness that felt thicker than it should have been, heavier, as if it had weight. And far below all of it, beneath the streets and the houses and the lies people told themselves about what Derry was and was not, something vast and ancient shifted its attention. Pennywise had not been sleeping, because sleeping was a human concept, a fragile thing meant to give small minds rest from themselves, and Pennywise had no need of such mercy. It waited. It listened. It tasted. Derry had always been rich with flavor, a town steeped in fear that had fermented over generations, fear that had soaked into the groundwater and the foundations and the soft, dreaming minds of its children. Fear that came back again and again, no matter how often it was forgotten or denied. But tonight, that familiar taste was wrong. There was a hollow note in it, an absence that stood out precisely because it should not have been there. Pennywise noticed it the way a tongue notices a missing tooth, returning to the gap again and again in faint irritation. Fear should have been blooming somewhere on the edge of town, ripening as something unfamiliar approached. Instead, there was nothing. Not calm, not bravery, just an empty space moving steadily closer. It reached outward, not with eyes or ears, but with that deeper sense that slid through half-formed dreams and shallow sleep, brushing against the sharp, bright fears of children who twitched beneath their blankets, afraid of closets and shadows and things that breathed softly under their beds. And then it felt him, a presence advancing toward Derry along the old road that cut through the trees, heavy and deliberate, not thinking in any way that resembled thought, and not afraid in any way that resembled courage. Pennywise paused. That alone was remarkable. Everything was afraid, eventually. Fear always found a way in, slipping through memory or guilt or pain, blooming in the soft places people pretended were sealed shut. But this thing did not have soft places. It was a closed shape, repeating itself endlessly, a loop that had forgotten how it had begun. For the first time in a very long while, Pennywise felt irritation stir, thin and sharp. Jason Voorhees stepped out of the forest just past the rusted town sign, the one that still claimed to welcome visitors as if Derry had ever truly done that. The sign bore old bullet holes arranged in a loose curve beneath the word welcome, giving it a suggestion of a smile that no one had intended and no one had bothered to fix. Jason did not look at it. He did not look at anything. He moved forward with a steady, tireless gait of something that had never considered the possibility of stopping, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth before lifting again, leaving deep impressions that slowly filled with black water. The hockey mask was cracked along one cheek, one strap frayed and barely holding, but whatever remained of the face beneath it no longer mattered, not to him and not to the world. He carried the machete low and back, the blade angled in the familiar way, dull with old stains that never quite came clean. There was no moon. Somewhere in town, a dog began to bark, its voice sharp with alarm, and then cut off abruptly, as if someone had reached down and turned a knob. Jason did not slow. Pennywise watched from everywhere at once, from the storm drain on Kansas Street where water whispered softly, from the rain-dark windows of abandoned houses that remembered screams, from the surface of the Kentuskig River as it flowed black and patient beneath the bridge. It tried something small first, more out of habit than confidence. A whisper, not quite sound, just the suggestion of something behind him that should not have been there. Jason did not turn. Pennywise pressed harder, shaping a memory sharp enough to cut, cold water closing over a child's head, arms flailing uselessly as lungs burned and the world narrowed to pain. Jason slowed, just a fraction. Pennywise felt a brief, anticipatory thrill. Then Jason resumed his pace, and the memory slid through him without catching, like water through a pipe. "That is interesting," Pennywise said, and the words came out of many mouths in many places. Jason crossed into the town proper. The first person to truly see him was Carl Dufresne, working the night shift at the Quick Mart on Up Mile Hill Road, who stepped outside for a cigarette and noticed the tall figure moving beneath the flickering street lamp. "Hey!" Carl called, without thinking, irritation outweighing caution. "Store's closed." The figure kept coming. Carl felt the prickle then, the delayed understanding that something about this was very wrong, and flicked his lighter, shielding the flame from a wind that had not been there a moment before. "Hey!" he shouted, louder now. Jason stopped. For a single heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the machete rose. Carl's fear arrived late and thin, blooming only as the blade fell, and Pennywise watched with mild disappointment as that fear dissipated without ripening, unfit to be consumed. Jason walked on, leaving the body beneath the dead street lamp as blood pooled black and glossy at its feet. The lamp flickered once and went out. Now Pennywise was paying attention. Not manifesting, not yet, but drawing closer to the surface of things, because Derry was its place, and nothing entered it without being accounted for. Jason moved deeper into town. Not stalking, not hunting, simply advancing, and people died because they were in the way. Each time, Pennywise observed the same pattern: confusion, delayed fear, and death. The fear was wrong, flat, incomplete. "This will not do," Pennywise murmured. On Neibolt Street, where houses sagged with remembered rot, the air thickened and shadows stretched unnaturally long, and at the far end of the road, a clown stood waiting. Not smiling, Well, not yet. "Wrong way," the clown said pleasantly. Jason stopped, the mask tilting slightly as he regarded it. For the first time, Pennywise felt something unexpected ripple back. Not fear, attention. Pennywise had learned long ago that haste was a human weakness, a thing born of beating hearts and short lifespans, and it had no intention of borrowing such limitations now, not when it stood before something that neither hurried nor hesitated, but simply continued. Neibolt Street sagged under the weight of its own history, the houses leaning inward as if listening, their windows dark and blind, the air heavy with the damp, sweet smell of rot and old water. And Jason Voorhees stood in the middle of it all, with rain beginning to bead and slide down the smooth curve of his mask.
"Wrong way," the clown repeated, its voice easy and conversational, as though offering directions to a lost tourist instead of blocking the path of a thing that had killed its way through 3 counties without ever once asking where it was going.
Jason did not answer. He did not raise the machete. He did not step forward. He simply stood there, rain pattering against his shoulders, water darkening the fabric of his jacket until it clung to him like a second skin. Pennywise watched closely, studying the minute details of his stillness, the way a predator studies unfamiliar prey, not because it doubts it can kill, but because it wants to understand what kind of killing will be required. "You do not talk," Pennywise said, and its smile widened just enough to show that the rows of teeth behind it were not quite right. "That's fine. Lots of things do not. Screaming is usually more useful anyway." Jason tilted his head a fraction more. The gesture was almost curious. Pennywise felt that attention again, that faint, unsettling sense of being perceived not as a nightmare or an object of terror, but simply as something in the way. It did not like that. The street bent.
Not visibly at first, not in a way that could be easily described afterward, but in the subtle, queasy way that perspective bends in a dream when you realize too late that the hallway is much longer than it should be, and the door you are running toward never seems to get any closer. Neibolt Street stretched, the houses pulling away from one another, their porches elongating, their foundations sinking into a soft, wet ground that was no longer soil, but something darker and colder. The rain thickened, turning suddenly frigid as it fell. Water gathered around Jason's boots. "You know this," Pennywise said, and now the voice came from the street itself, from the walls, from the rain striking the pavement. "You always know this." The pavement dissolved. The smell of lake water replaced the smell of rot, sharp and metallic and old, carrying with it the distant echo of summer laughter that had long since curdled into something else. Camp Crystal Lake rose around him with obscene immediacy. The wooden cabins standing too straight, too intact, the trees crowding close as if eager to watch. The dock stretched out over the dark water, its boards slick and shining. Jason stood ankle-deep at first, then calf-deep as the water crept higher, cold fingers wrapping around his legs. The machete dipped, the tip touching the surface of the lake and sending out slow, concentric ripples. Pennywise did not appear here as a clown. It did not need to. It let the lake do the work. Let the memory speak in the language it already knew. "You were small," Pennywise said softly. "You were alone, and you called out, and no one came." The water rose to Jason's knees. His grip tightened on the machete, leather creaking faintly beneath his fingers. Pennywise leaned closer, though there was no body to lean with, only presence pressing in on all sides. "You were not afraid at first," it went on. "Children rarely are. They think someone will notice. Someone always notices." The water climbed to his waist. Jason's shoulders tensed, not in panic, in resistance. Pennywise felt the shape of something there, something dense and immovable, like a knot in the world that refused to come undone. "That's right," Pennywise murmured. "Remember." The lake surged suddenly, rising to Jason's chest, cold enough to burn, and for the briefest instant, so brief that Pennywise might have imagined it if it had not been watching so closely, something flickered behind the blank oval of the mask. Not fear, recognition. And Pennywise lunged for it. The world snapped back. Neibolt Street reasserted itself with a sound like a great breath being released, the houses slamming back into place, the pavement hard beneath Jason's boots once more, rain falling normally again, heavy and warm. The clown staggered backward, its polished shoes splashing in a puddle that had not been there a moment before. Jason raised the machete. He swung. The blade passed through the clown's chest without resistance, parting it like mist, and struck the house behind it hard enough to bite into rotting wood with a meaty thud. The clown dissolved, laughter echoing briefly before cutting off. Jason did not wait. He stepped forward again, resuming his steady progress down the street. Pennywise recoiled, not in pain, but in something uncomfortably close to irritation shading into anger. That had been a test. Jason Voorhees had failed it in an unexpected way. Beneath Derry, in spaces that could not be mapped and chambers that had never known light, Pennywise gathered itself more fully than it had in decades. It shed the clown's shape, then the suggestion of shape altogether, expanding its awareness until it brushed against every sleeping mind in town, every uneasy dream, every half-remembered childhood terror. Jason Voorhees was not feeding it. Worse, he was interfering. The deaths he caused were inefficient, their fear thin and poorly formed, like unripe fruit knocked from the branch before it could sweeten. And Pennywise could not allow that to continue. "This is my place," Pennywise thought. And the thought carried weight, pressing outward into the fabric of the town itself. "You walk here because I allow it." Jason moved on to Main Street, where the storefronts stood dark and empty, display windows reflecting his tall shape back at him in warped fragments. A woman crouched behind a parked car, hands over her mouth, eyes wide and wet with terror as she watched him pass. Jason did not look at her. She bolted anyway, shoes slapping loudly against wet pavement, her fear spiking sharp and bright as she ran. Pennywise reached for that fear instinctively, drawing it in, tasting it. It was good, rich, normal. For a moment, Pennywise almost forgave Jason. Almost. Then Jason turned, as if guided by something deeper than sound, and the machete rose and fell. The woman's scream cut off abruptly. The fear vanished with her. Pennywise snarled, a sound that rattled windows and sent a flock of birds exploding out of a nearby tree in a frenzy of wings. "That," Pennywise said, and its voice rolled through the empty street like distant thunder, "was mine." Jason stopped again. Slowly, deliberately, he turned toward the sound. For the first time, Pennywise did not hide. The air in front of Jason thickened, darkening as if reality itself were bruising, and something immense pressed close, not bothering with disguise or charm. The streetlights flickered back on, all at once, bathing the scene in harsh white light. People would later remember this moment differently, those who remembered it at all, describing strange shadows and a sense of pressure, of being watched by something too large to see. Jason felt none of that. He felt resistance. The presence slammed into him, not as force, but as concept, bending space around his body, trying to compress him, to redefine him, to pull him apart at the seams where meaning met memory. "You are not unique," Pennywise said, and now there was no humor left in its voice. "You are not special. You are repetition. I have consumed worse than you." Jason took a step forward. The pressure increased, the air trembling, windows spiderwebbing with cracks as the unseen weight bore down harder. Jason took another step. The machete trembled in his hand, vibrating faintly as if responding to some deeper frequency. Pennywise felt it then, clearly and unmistakably. Jason was not afraid. He was not brave. He was not defiant. He was inevitable. That realization struck Pennywise harder than any blade could have. It changed tactics instantly. The street folded inward, collapsing into a narrow corridor that smelled of damp wood and old blood. Walls pressing close, ceiling low, the space deliberately constricting, not to frighten, but to contain. "This is not a lake," Pennywise said, its voice echoing strangely. "This is a box." Jason swung. The blade struck the wall, sparks flying as metal met something harder than wood. The corridor shuddered. Pennywise tightened its grip, the space constricting further, squeezing Jason's shoulders, his chest, his arms, compressing him into something smaller, weaker, manageable. For the first time since entering Derry, Jason struggled. Not wildly, methodically. Muscle against pressure, will against concept. The corridor creaked and groaned, hairline fractures spreading along the walls like veins. Pennywise felt a flicker of something it had not felt in a very long time. Concern. "You do not understand what you are," Pennywise said, and now there was urgency beneath the words. "You are a tool. Tools break." Jason's grip on the machete tightened. He raised it with effort, joints grinding audibly, and brought it down with a force that felt less like a blow and more like an assertion. The corridor split. Reality cracked open with a sound like tearing cloth, and the pressure vanished in an instant, dumping both of them back onto Main Street amid shattered glass and flickering lights. Pennywise recoiled sharply. Jason straightened. Rain ran off him in steady streams. Neither moved for a long moment. Then Pennywise laughed. It was not the high, mocking laugh of the clown. It was deep, resonant, and edged with something like appreciation. "Oh," Pennywise said quietly, "you are going to be very useful." And somewhere in the depths beneath Derry, something ancient began to shift its plans, not toward removal, not toward escape, but toward ownership. Jason Voorhees stepped forward again, and this time, Pennywise did not retreat. Rain continued to fall, steady and unremarkable now, tapping against storefront awnings and pooling in the cracks of the street, and in that ordinary sound, there was something deeply wrong, because nothing about what stood on Main Street deserved to be accompanied by anything so mundane. Jason Voorhees took another step forward. The movement was slow, heavy, inevitable, the kind of motion that did not ask permission from the world but assumed compliance. And Pennywise felt the shape of it clearly now. Not a hunter seeking prey, not even a force of chaos, but a process, like rust or rot or gravity. Something that did not need intent to do harm because harm was simply the byproduct of its existence. "That's far enough," Pennywise said, and the words carried weight, not volume, pressing outward through the wet air and into the bones of the buildings, making old brick groan and loose signs shudder on their hooks. Jason did not stop. The distance between them closed. Pennywise did not retreat this time, but it did change, its presence pulling inward, condensing, shedding the diffuse pressure it had been exerting across the street and drawing itself into a tighter, more deliberate configuration. This was not a form meant to frighten. This was a form meant to assert. The air thickened around Jason's head, not enough to slow him, but enough to announce that something was happening on a level he did not normally interact with, something that did not concern muscle or bone or blood. "You do not belong to yourself," Pennywise said, and now the voice came from directly in front of him, low and steady, stripped of mockery. "You never did. You were shaped. You were pointed. You were loosed." Jason raised the machete. The blade hesitated for the first time, not because of fear, but because the space it occupied resisted being occupied at all, vibrating faintly as if the air had grown dense and elastic. Pennywise felt the contact, that crude but persistent insistence, and allowed itself a thin, humorless smile. "Yes," it said. "Like that. Push." It let the pressure increase, not all at once, gradually. Jason's arm trembled, muscles bunching and straining beneath his jacket as he forced the blade forward, inch by inch, the metal humming softly, the sound setting teeth on edge for anyone within half a mile who was still awake. Windows along the street cracked in delicate spiderwebs. Somewhere, a car alarm began to wail and then choked itself silent. "You kill," Pennywise went on, circling him now without moving, shifting perspective instead of position so that Jason felt watched from all sides at once. "You remove obstacles. You simplify the world. That is what you were made to do." Then the pressure increased again. Jason's knees bent slightly, boots skidding back a fraction of an inch on wet pavement. This was new, so not pain, the resistance with intent. "But you do not choose," Pennywise said. "You never learned how." Jason growled. It was a low, rough sound, dragged up from somewhere deep and unused, more vibration than voice, and Pennywise felt it ripple through the space between them, like a dropped stone through still water. There. That. Pennywise seized on it instantly. The street around them peeled away, not violently, not in the dramatic fashion of collapsing worlds or screaming skies, but quietly, the way wallpaper peels from a damp wall, revealing something older and uglier beneath. Main Street receded, the buildings blurring and dissolving until there was only darkness and a single wavering light. A cabin, small, wooden, poorly maintained. Rain struck its roof in a familiar, maddening rhythm. Jason stood before it, machete lowered, breath heavy and uneven behind the mask. The smell hit him next. Damp wood, mildew, old smoke. And beneath it all, the faint, unmistakable scent of fear that had soaked into the place so thoroughly it might as well have been part of the structure. "You remember this," Pennywise said. And now the voice came from inside the cabin, from the walls, from the air itself. "You always remember this." The door creaked open. Inside, a woman stood with her back turned, shoulders tense, hair pulled tight, as if order itself might hold the world together if she willed it hard enough. "Mom," Jason rasped. The words scraped his throat raw. She turned. Her face was wrong. Not monstrous. Worse. Disappointed. Her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that burned. "You let them laugh at you," she said, and her voice was sharp and familiar and merciless. "You let them take you from me." Jason staggered forward a step. "No," he said, the word barely more than breath. You were weak," she went on, advancing now, fingers stabbing the air with each word. "You failed me." Pennywise felt it then. Felt the way something inside Jason twisted, not in fear, but in something deeper and more corrosive, something that had never healed because it had never been allowed to surface. Guilt. That was the seam. That was the crack. The cabin began to close in, walls inching inward, ceiling lowering, the space compressing with deliberate slowness, giving the moment time to ripen. "You killed for me," the woman said. "You killed because you had to. And now look at you." She gestured around them. Jason's grip on the machete loosened, just a fraction. Pennywise pressed. "And if you stop," it whispered, slipping into her voice so seamlessly there was no difference at all. "There's nothing left, is there?" The walls creaked. The air grew thin. Jason dropped to one knee, and for the first time, Pennywise felt certainty. This was not fear, but it would serve. It always did. Jason's head bowed, and the machete slipped from his fingers and struck the floor with a hollow clatter. Pennywise leaned in, not physically, but conceptually, preparing to close, to fold this looping, stubborn thing into something smaller, something usable. "Yes," it murmured. "That's it. Let go." Jason's shoulders shook. Pennywise reached, and then Jason laughed. It was a terrible sound, broken, joyless. It did not rise or fall. It simply existed, vibrating through the cramped space like a fault line shifting deep underground. "No," Jason said, and now there was strength in the word. Crude and unrefined, but undeniable. "You're wrong." The woman froze. The cabin trembled. Jason pushed himself upright, slow but steady, and lifted his head. "There was always something left," he said. "There was always this." He clenched his fist. The cabin shattered. The walls exploded outward in a storm of splintered wood and collapsing memory, the scene ripping itself apart as Jason surged forward, the weight pressing on him suddenly gone, replaced by open space and cold night air. They were back on Main Street. The machete was in Jason's hand again. Pennywise reeled, not injured, but forced back. That laugh echoed still, faintly, and Pennywise felt something tighten inside itself, something ancient and sharp. "That," Pennywise said quietly, "was a mistake." The streetlights burst simultaneously, plunging the town back into darkness, and this time, the dark did not feel empty. It felt intentional. "You do not stop," Pennywise went on, its voice now vast and distant, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You do not question. You do not break." The darkness thickened, pressing in from all sides, not like a wall, but like a tide. Jason stood firm. "But you do not change," Pennywise finished. And that was when the town itself began to move. Not buildings, not streets. Derry, the idea of it. Every gutter, every basement, every forgotten place where fear had once pooled and been left to rot opened inward, converging, aligning toward Jason's position with slow, grinding inevitability. This was not an attack. This was assimilation. Jason lifted the machete. The darkness swallowed the blade. Pennywise watched, patient now, absolute in its understanding. "You can walk forever," it said, "but you are walking into me." And for the first time since he had entered Derry, Jason Voorhees hesitated. Not because he was afraid, but because the path ahead no longer existed. It was gone, replaced by something vast and waiting. Part 3 ends here. The air thickened around Jason, as if the very molecules had grown heavy with intent. Not malevolent in the way of a mindless predator, but deliberate, calculated, patient, and all-encompassing. Main Street, the same street he had stalked countless times in his slow, methodical way, no longer existed as a series of buildings and familiar alleys. It had dissolved into something far older, something alive in a way that defied reason, and every step he took reverberated through the warped geometry of Derry itself, a soundless hammer striking an invisible anvil. Pennywise emerged, not in clown form, not in any human recognizable shape, but as a presence, immense and formless, a shifting darkness that pressed on the edges of Jason's perception, filling every space he could see and the spaces he could not. It whispered, not words exactly, but a vibration, a resonance that seemed to speak directly to the parts of him that had never learned language and never needed it. "You cannot leave. You do not leave. You are part of this." Jason moved, but his steps were slow, deliberate. The machete, always an extension of his will, seemed almost insignificant in the presence of something that did not occupy space in the ordinary sense. And yet Pennywise did not attack outright, for it understood instinctively the difference between opposition and useless resistance. It had tested him, probed him, nudged him, and now it was time to assert, to bend the impossible geometry of Derry itself against him. The ground beneath his boots shifted imperceptibly, subtly enough that he did not stumble, but felt it in his bones, the feeling of the earth no longer reliable. The buildings around him warped and twisted, stretching upward impossibly, elongating their shadowed windows into dark, toothy grins, the streetlights bending and swaying as though the town were leaning in to watch the inevitable. And then, without warning, the shadows detached from the structures entirely, flowing across the pavement in thick, viscous shapes that slithered toward Jason like liquid smoke. He raised the machete, swinging at nothing, at shadows that had no body, that dissolved under the arc of steel and reformed moments later, pressing closer, heavier, colder. Pennywise laughed. Not a laugh that could be heard, but a vibration that moved through the air into bone and sinew, and Jason's head jerked slightly, responding as though the sound had physical mass. The waterlogged air clung to his skin, making every movement a measured effort, every breath heavy with the smell of decay and old iron.
the kind of stench that lingered in forgotten basements, in the soil beneath a sunless lake. "Stop," Pennywise said at last, its voice emerging like a storm from everywhere and nowhere. "Stop resisting. You are not here to resist. You are here because I allowed it, because I shaped it. Everything you are, every swing, every death, every step toward violence has led you here. And here, you are mine." Jason did not respond. His head tilted slightly under the mask, a motion so small it might have gone unnoticed if the town itself had not been bending in response. His fists tightened around the machete handle. For the first time, he hesitated, not in fear, not in indecision, but in recognition. Pennywise was not an adversary in the normal sense. It was not a creature to be hunted, to be fought in the physical realm. It was the sum of the fear of generations, the marrow-deep hunger that waited in corners, in drains, in old houses, in the very notion of night itself. It could not be killed, and yet it existed here, waiting for him, and the thought, fleeting and dangerous, passed through the corners of Jason's mind. This was a force even he might not overcome. Pennywise's presence shifted again, folding the city around him like a living origami. The street twisted, coiling over itself, the pavement rippling like liquid mercury, while buildings compressed into impossible angles. Shadows became solid, reaching with appendages that dripped and stretched, pressing against his chest, wrapping around his arms, tugging, pulling, testing, bending. And in the center of it all, Jason remained upright, machete poised, a monument of persistence in a world that had abandoned all logic. "You will break," Pennywise said. "I have broken children. I have broken fathers. I have devoured hope and left hollow shells to wander. You are a tool, a puppet, a process, and all processes bend to me eventually." Jason raised the machete, and the blade gleamed in the unnatural light, a promise of violence, a relic of past bloodshed. He moved toward one of the appendages, slowly, mechanically, and swung. The shadow recoiled but reformed immediately, thicker, heavier, wrapping itself around his leg. The resistance was suffocating, invisible hands pressing into bone, into muscle, into something more primal, the instinct to act without thinking, to kill without hesitation. Jason's steps faltered but never stopped. And then the air shifted again. A cold wind swept through the impossible street, carrying with it echoes of laughter, children's laughter, broken and warped, reverberating through time as though Pennywise had plucked it from every memory it had ever consumed. Jason stumbled but regained his stance, each step a fight against the pull of a world that did not exist in the normal sense. Pennywise pressed closer, now fully aware of the singularity of its focus, the inevitable shaping of this creature into something that could finally, wholly, belong to it.
"You cannot resist what you were born for," Pennywise said. "You cannot stand outside of me. You will be mine in ways you do not yet understand."
Jason's masked head turned slightly, eyes, not human, not seen, but somehow perceived, fixed on the shifting darkness before him. And for the first time, the machete lowered fractionally, a single, small concession. But it was not fear, and it was not surrender. It was recognition. This fight was no longer physical. It was metaphysical. It was the alignment of inevitabilities. And Pennywise, in all its infinite hunger, knew it had found something it had not felt in decades. A rival not in skill, not in will, but in inevitability itself. The world around them froze, if only for a heartbeat. Rain hung motionless in the air, dripping off rooftops in suspended droplets. Shadows recoiled, hesitant, unsure. The smell of rot and iron thickened until it was almost tactile. And then Pennywise spoke, soft as a thought, as a promise. "I will make this end my way." Jason stepped forward. The darkness surged. The streets of Derry bent. The sky itself rippled. And somewhere, deep within the folds of the town, Pennywise let itself smile. Part 4 ends here. The night deepened. Yet it was not night in any ordinary sense. It was a living black, thick and viscous, pressing against the edges of reality, until Derry itself felt like a thought, fragile and trembling, a memory waiting to snap.
Jason Voorhees moved forward, slow and relentless. The weight of every past kill, every swing of the machete, every silent hour spent stalking his prey, now merging into a single, driving purpose. But the street, if it could still be called that, was no longer linear, no longer coherent. Buildings stretched and compressed, doors opened into walls, windows became gaping mouths, and all the while, Pennywise hovered somewhere between form and absence, a presence as old as the deep places of the earth, as ancient as the darkness behind human eyes.
"You are persistent," Pennywise said, voice both soft and immense, seeming to vibrate through Jason's bones, through the air, through time itself. "I will give you that. But you are predictable. You do not know what you face." Jason swung the machete, a precise, practiced arc, slicing through a shadow that immediately reformed, thicker now, multiplying, reaching out like a tide of living darkness. The metal felt heavier than usual, as though the air itself resisted him, dense and thick and purposeful. Every step he took left an impression in the warped street, but the impression was temporary, like footprints in water that immediately vanish, and he understood instantly that his usual method, slow, deliberate, unstoppable, would not suffice here. This was a battle that required more than strength. It required the impossible. Pennywise advanced, but it did not walk. It flowed. It seeped. Its shape shifted constantly. A face here, a clawed hand there, a gaping maw behind where a wall had been only moments ago. And yet, always, it was everywhere at once, a force not bound by the ordinary rules of space, time, or fear. "I am the town," it said. "I am the memory of your mother, the echo of every death, the reflection of every child's cry. You may kill, you may strike, but you cannot undo me." Jason swung again. The shadow around him recoiled, twisted, then surged forward like a tidal wave of night. The machete bit through nothing and hit air. Still, he pressed forward, relentless, stepping through impossible geometry, his movement an anachronism, something utterly alien to the rules that now governed this place. His breathing, muffled behind the mask, was steady. He was unafraid, unthinking. Yet he felt something he had never felt, the weight of inevitability pressing not on him, but on the very world, bending and twisting it around his motion. The ground beneath his boots gave way suddenly, collapsing not into void, but into a mirrored surface, reflecting 1,000 Jason Voorhees figures, each one identical, each one poised to strike,
each one a distorted echo of every kill he had ever made. Pennywise laughed, a soundless vibration that pressed against his skull, but the laughter did not startle him. It was recognition that the game had changed.
"You cannot fight me with steel,"
Pennywise whispered. Its form blurred into something enormous, a towering, shifting abstraction, part clown, part darkness, part everything he had ever feared and yet had never seen.
"I am older than your pain, older than your death. You belong to me already, as all things do."
Jason stepped forward, and the reflection waves multiplied. Each time the machete swung, it passed through phantom forms that reformed instantly, multiplying, confusing, overwhelming. He hacked, swung, struck, each movement precise, each strike a test of will, each blow meeting resistance not physical, but conceptual. And then Pennywise pulsed. Not violently, not with motion, but like the sudden beat of a heart echoing in a void. The pulse radiated outward, and suddenly the reflections solidified, breaking apart, folding, turning into children, screaming, laughing, crying, fleeing. The images were real enough to touch, real enough to smell, but intangible enough to bite and find nothing. Jason froze for a heartbeat, just long enough to sense the shift. This was no longer a fight of bodies. It was the shaping of reality around him, the sculpting of inevitability. And he understood that Pennywise did not need to strike him in order to win. Every strike he made, every step he took, every swing of his blade was already accounted for, already absorbed into the design of something larger.
"You are stubborn,"
Pennywise said, calm now, omnipresent, omniscient.
"I will give you that. But even your persistence is mine to shape."
Then it happened. The world twisted violently, the street folding upward like a collapsing accordion, the sky bending downward into a suffocating dome, and all at once Jason was lifted, suspended not by force, but by the will of the entity itself, caught in a grip that existed everywhere and nowhere. His machete hung limp in his hand, and for the first time, the mask could not hide the recognition. He had been outmatched.
"You may walk,"
Pennywise said, voice now directly inside him, inside his head, inside his perception of every possible motion.
"You may swing, you may strike, you may persist, but you are walking into me, and I am already inside you."
Jason's head tilted slightly, a gesture of resistance, a gesture that meant nothing. And Pennywise allowed itself a slow, deliberate smile, feeling the subtle twisting of inevitability tighten. The air grew thick, solid, pressing, suffocating in the way that memory itself can. And then the laughter began, a chorus of all the town's lost and frightened children, distorted, endless, echoing, vibrating through every corner of his being. And then, with a motion that was at once sudden and inexorably slow, Pennywise reached, not with hands, not with claws, not with fangs, but with the concept of itself. And Jason Voorhees, the unstoppable, the unfeeling, the relentless, felt his body bend, shift, and fold into a position not of his choosing, a position that was not his own. The machete slipped from his fingers. The mask, his iconic mask, shifted and warped against his face as if it were clay, no longer protective, no longer separating him from the world. And then, with the inevitability of a collapsing star, Pennywise folded him into the darkness, absorbed him fully, not destroyed, but reshaped, integrated, a fragment of the ever-hungry, ever-shifting, eternal monster that Derry had always known. Jason Voorhees ceased to exist as he had been. Pennywise laughed, and the town, breathing once again in ordinary rhythm, did not know that anything had changed, except that somewhere, in the deep, crooked alleys and forgotten basements, the sense of inevitability had grown, heavier, more patient, and utterly unstoppable. Part 5 ends here. The morning came, though it was not morning in the ordinary sense. The sky above Derry was a pale, trembling gray, the kind of gray that made everything appear smaller, weaker, less certain, as if even the sun feared to rise fully. The streets were empty, eerily quiet, and yet beneath the calm, beneath the apparent ordinariness, something had shifted. Something had entered the marrow of the town, as subtle and unstoppable as a thought that cannot be unthought, as inevitable as the tide. Pennywise moved through Derry not as a creature stalking its prey, but as an idea, a truth, a principle, relentless, ancient, and infinite. The town itself seemed to pulse with its presence, every street corner a reminder, every shadow a whisper, every child's laugh a memory warped and twisted into expectation. And somewhere in the folds of that invisible network, Jason Voorhees existed no longer as a man, no longer as a monster he had once been, but as a fragment of the endless hunger folded into the geometry of inevitability, reshaped, integrated, becoming part of something older and larger than the forest, older than the lake, older than the very concept of fear. The people of Derry went about their day as though nothing had happened, and in one sense, nothing had. The electrical lines hummed again, the clocks ticked, and the faint smell of damp decay that lingered in corners faded beneath ordinary odors: gasoline, coffee, fresh bread. And yet, if one looked closely, if one dared to perceive the spaces between things, the unseen currents that connected every doorway, every cellar, every drain, there was a sense of watching, of waiting, of inevitability. In the center of the town, at the very heart of its crooked streets and forgotten cellars, a shadow lingered. It was not a shadow in the ordinary sense. It had no shape, no edges, no single form, yet it moved, it pulsed, it watched. And when the first child walked past an alleyway too narrow to notice, when the first parent glanced at the wrong window, when the first dog barked at nothing in particular, there was a subtle twitch in the air, a vibration that carried through bone and thought, and somewhere deep inside, everyone knew without knowing, feared without fear, that the world had changed in a way they could not name. Pennywise had won. Not with fists, not with claws, not with sudden violence, but with inevitability, with the quiet, patient folding of a force older than understanding into the very fabric of reality. Jason had been nothing more than a tool, a test, a reminder of persistence, and now that persistence had been absorbed, contained, rendered part of the machinery that would continue, endlessly, timelessly, silently, waiting for the next unwary soul to walk into its scope. And yet there was one more thing, one last, subtle, perverse twist that marked the end not as a resolution, but as a scar on the world. Because even as Pennywise lingered in the shadows, even as it pulsed through the unseen veins of the town. There was a flicker, a reflection, a whisper, a movement at the edge of perception that had not been there before. A fragment, broken but alive, of something that could not be fully contained. And though it was weak, and though it was incomplete, it carried the inevitability of violence, the persistence of vengeance, and the unshakable weight of being a tiny echo of Jason Voorhees that had not been swallowed entirely, that had not been fully erased. It was not enough to challenge Pennywise, not enough to undo what had been done, but it was enough to leave a mark, a subtle distortion, a faint tremor in the dark corridors of the town that would make the next confrontation, whenever it came, inevitable in its own way. The fragment pulsed faintly, a heartbeat in the darkness, a reminder that even in defeat, something eternal could persist. The citizens of Derry, oblivious to the cosmic violence that had occurred, would go on with their lives. Children would play in streets that had been folded, reshaped, warped in ways they could not see. Parents would argue over groceries, drive their cars to work, glance at cracked windows, never noticing the subtle twitch in the corner of vision, the pulse beneath the floorboards. And somewhere, deep beneath the town, in the empty spaces between walls, between floors, between thought and perception, Pennywise waited, patient, infinite, eternal, its hunger untouched, its victory absolute, yet now slightly more aware, slightly more amused, slightly more careful. Jason Voorhees, the unstoppable, relentless, eternal killer, existed no longer as he had, yet a fragment of his persistence lingered, a faint tremor in the shape of inevitability, and it would whisper, sometime, somewhere, when the dark corners aligned, when the timing was right, that the hunger could be resisted, briefly, ever so briefly, in the pulse of a single, fractured heartbeat. And Derry, breathing quietly under the gray sky, trembled just enough to feel it. The story ended not with a scream, not with a fight, not with justice, but with a quiet, unbearable certainty. Pennywise had won. And yet, the shadow of Jason's persistence, however faint, remained. A final, quiet echo of inevitability, folded into the darkness, ready to stir when least expected.